The Terror of a Thousand Worlds. The Galactic Council had many names for it. Vrethkel the Unmerciful, the Shadow that Burns, the last thing you see. In 17 different star systems, its name was used to silence crying hatchlings and frighten young ones into obedience. Mothers on the ocean world of Yethra would whisper it to stop their young from wandering near the deep waters. Elders on the crystalline plateaus of Zorthas had carved it into warning stones placed at the edges of safe territory. In the merchant hubs of the Outer Crescent, insurance brokers had an unofficial subclause in their contracts, a small, easy-to-miss paragraph near the bottom that simply read, "Coverage does not extend to losses incurred within Vrethkel's known range. No exceptions, no appeals, no refunds." Entire fleets had turned their vessels around rather than enter the sector where Vrethkel made its home, a scorched, hollow planet it had personally cracked open like an egg 3 centuries ago, simply because something had been living inside it that annoyed the dragon. Nobody knew what that something had been. Nobody had gone to check. The general philosophical consensus across 12 civilizations was that some questions were better left unasked, and the particulars of what had irritated the most dangerous creature in the known galaxy were firmly in that category. Vrethkel was, by every measurable metric, the single most dangerous living creature in the known galaxy. It stood 40 meters tall at the shoulder, tall enough that the shadow it cast at midday covered entire towns. Its scales were the color of collapsed stars, a deep and shifting black that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it, so that looking at the dragon directly in bright conditions was like trying to focus on a hole cut in the sky. Each of its 6 wings could generate atmospheric storms capable of leveling cities when fully extended. The Zethali Meteorological Archives contained 16 separate documented incidents of catastrophic weather events, traced back to Vrethkel simply stretching before returning to sleep. Its fire burned at temperatures that made Zethali scientists weep when they tried to model it, not metaphorically, but literally, because 3 of the research team had experienced what their department head diplomatically termed an emotional response to thermodynamic impossibility upon reviewing the data. It had destroyed a war cruiser with a single tail swipe once, apparently because the cruiser's pilot had flown too close while Vrethkel was sleeping, and the dragon had considered that rude. The tail swipe had been so casual, so entirely without urgency, that the surveillance footage, reviewed obsessively by military analysts for years afterward, showed no change whatsoever in Vrethkel's resting posture before or after. It had destroyed a Class 7 warship the way a sleeping human swats a mosquito, and then gone directly back to sleep. The Zyphori Dominion had spent 90 years attempting to classify it as a Category Omega threat and relocate it. 90 years was a significant institutional investment. It represented 4 full generations of Zyphori military leadership, 6 complete overhauls of their threat classification system, and enough bureaucratic paperwork to fill a small moon. 17 diplomatic envoys had been sent over that period. 16 had returned with severe psychological trauma and a shared unwillingness to discuss what they had witnessed. Their medical files flagged with conditions that the Zyphori healthcare system had to create new terminology for. One had not returned at all, though his ship had been found later neatly folded, like a piece of paper, sitting on an asteroid with a single claw mark through the hull that researchers still studied with a kind of reverent, horrified fascination. The fold lines were clean. That was what unsettled people most, the precision of it. Nobody negotiated with Vrethkel. Nobody reasoned with Vrethkel. No transmission had ever been acknowledged. No offering had ever been accepted. No warning had ever been issued before an attack, because Vrethkel apparently did not feel that what it was doing required explanation or justification. You either avoided it entirely, or you accepted whatever terrible fate it had decided for you with the specific brand of helpless resignation that the galaxy reserved for natural disasters, supernovas, and other forces that were simply beyond the reach of politics. This was the way of things. The entire galaxy had agreed on it, ratified it, filed it, and made peace with it over the course of several centuries. And then humanity joined the Galactic Council, and things became considerably more complicated. The human delegation arrived on Council Station Verath 7 with their characteristic cheerfulness, their bizarre diplomatic customs involving beverages served at dangerously high temperatures, and to the open, poorly concealed horror of every senior council member present, 3 children in tow. The children were not small in the way that made them seem fragile or ignorable. They were small in the way that made them mobile, conspicuous, and possessed of a social confidence that most trained diplomats spent decades trying to develop and never quite managed. They had opinions. They shared those opinions freely and without apparent concern for whether the recipient was a decorated war veteran, a species elder, or an alien being whose natural form was, technically, classified as a mild biohazard in 3 jurisdictions. None of this seemed to register as relevant to them. Ambassador Yara Osai had explained, when the Zyphery representative Kethven politely, very politely, with the careful precision of someone who had been extensively briefed on human sensitivity to criticism of their young, suggested that perhaps children did not belong at an intergalactic diplomatic summit, that the journey had been 6 months long, that her sister had needed emergency surgery, and that her niece Sophia had therefore come along because there had been no other option. And that if Kethven had a problem with a 7-year-old attending a few low-priority briefings, he was welcome to file a formal complaint, and she would read it with great interest. The tone in which Ambassador Osai delivered this statement was that of a woman who had slept approximately 4 hours per night for the past 6 months, was running entirely on professional obligation and sheer force of will, and had already mentally allocated 0 of her remaining patience to this particular concern. Kethven, who had navigated the politics of 4 star systems and survived 2 civil wars, recognized that tone immediately and made the sensible decision. He did not file the complaint. He had instead watched, with growing and inexplicable unease, as the 3 human children proceeded to befriend every species on the station with a speed and thoroughness that made seasoned diplomats feel inadequate and slightly defensive. They learned names, they remembered preferences. They asked questions with an earnestness that was somehow more disarming than any calculated diplomatic technique, because it was not calculated at all. It was simply genuine, uncomplicated interest in whatever was in front of them, which turned out to be an extraordinarily powerful social tool that no council member had thought to classify as such because they had never encountered it deployed at this scale. Within 2 days, Sophia, 7 years old, wearing a jacket with embroidered stars on the sleeves, with 2 braids and a gap where she'd recently lost a tooth, had learned 6 words in Zyphery and used them to complement Kethvan's secondary eye cluster in the formal register reserved for addressing elders and persons of significant honor. Which meant either that she had studied the language's social stratification out of pure curiosity, or that she had asked someone to teach her specifically the most respectful available option. Both possibilities were equally alarming in their own way. Kethvan had been so entirely unprepared for the compliment that he'd approved 3 human trade requests without reading them. He discovered this 2 days later, and had experienced what his personal physician described as an episode of acute professional humiliation. That was, ultimately not as unpleasant as he'd expected because the trade terms turned out to be quite reasonable. It was during the 3rd week of the summit that the emergency arose, the kind of emergency that silenced rooms. A distress signal, originating from the Outer Crescent, a human cargo vessel, the Meridian carrying medical supplies urgently needed at the frontier colony on Hellos IV, where a respiratory illness had been spreading through the settlement for 2 months. It had suffered a catastrophic navigation failure 3 hours prior, the kind that happened when 2 systems failed simultaneously in a way the engineering team hadn't predicted, and it had drifted helplessly, at the mercy of local gravitational currents, directly into the one region of space that no sane being entered voluntarily under any circumstances whatsoever. Vrethkel sector. The words landed in the council chamber like something physical. A heaviness settled over the room, specific and recognizable, the particular weight of a situation in which the outcome was already understood, and the only remaining question was how to frame it, how to record it, how to mourn it in the proper form. "We cannot send a rescue," Kethven said, and his voice carried the flat, exhausted quality of someone stating something so obvious that saying it aloud felt almost insulting, but which needed to be said anyway because the humans in the room had expressions that suggested they were about to disagree. "Any vessel we dispatch into that sector will be destroyed. The Meridian's crew are lost. We will observe a period of mourning and—" "There are 11 people on that ship," Ambassador Osai said. Her voice was quiet, not aggressive, not emotional in a way that could be categorized as irrational. It was the voice of a person who was holding a fact in both hands and placing it carefully on the table, making sure everyone in the room could see its weight. "Yes," said Kethven with the terrible patience of someone who had delivered this kind of news before. "And there will be 11 more lost if we send a rescue team into Vrethkel's territory. We are not being callous, Ambassador. We are being rational. The mathematics do not change because the situation is painful." "How long would it take for the Meridian to drift back out of the Dragon's range on its own?" asked Lieutenant Commander Priya Nair. She was the mission's tactical officer, and she was studying the navigational charts with an expression that other members of the human delegation had learned, over 6 months, to recognize and approach with caution. It was the focused, slightly tilted expression of a human who was doing math, not just arithmetic, but the kind of lateral, contingency-laden strategic calculation that humans performed when they had decided that the current situation was a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be accepted, and were in the process of identifying which variables might be movable. Every alien diplomat who had worked with humans long enough had learned to watch for that expression, because it reliably preceded proposals that sounded impossible right up until the moment they weren't. The Zethali science delegate pulled up the calculations, their 4 fingers moving quickly across the display surface. At current drift velocity, approximately 19 days. However, Vrethkel's recorded flight patterns suggest a 43% probability that the Dragon will notice the vessel within 48 hours, Nair finished, reading the same projection on her own display simultaneously. So we have 2 days before there's a near-even chance the Dragon destroys the ship, and 19 days before it drifts to safety on its own without intervention. She set down her display. She did not look at it again. Someone needs to go keep the Dragon distracted for 19 days. The silence that followed this statement was the kind that has texture. It was not the silence of disbelief. Everyone in the room understood exactly what had been said. It was the silence of an entire chamber of experienced, intelligent, widely traveled beings simultaneously searching for a flaw in the logic and failing to find one. "You are joking," said Ostel, the Zyphuri representative from the secondary chamber, a broad-shouldered being with 4 arms and the specific bearing of someone who had survived 4 wars and made a personal and ongoing commitment to fearing nothing because the alternative was exhausting. "You are suggesting that a person simply go to Vrethkel and what? Hold its attention for 19 consecutive days while also not dying." "Not a person," said Nair. Her expression was doing something that the alien delegates couldn't quite classify, something careful and complicated that lived in the territory between reluctance and certainty. "A delegation. A diplomatic envoy, officially framed. If the Council formally designates the contact attempt as a diplomatic mission under Article 9 of the Interspecies Engagement Protocols. Every diplomatic envoy ever sent to that creature has ended in catastrophe." Ostel's voice had the controlled edge of someone who was calm only because they were actively working at it. 16 traumatized survivors and 1 folded ship, Lieutenant Commander. Those are the results of every previous attempt at engagement. "The Council's envoys, yes," Nair said, and now her voice had shifted into a register that Ambassador Osa recognized, the register Nair used when she was about to say something that the room was not going to like and had decided to say it anyway. "I've been reviewing the xenobiological survey data on Vrethkel. The full archive, not just the threat assessments. Specifically the behavioral analysis sections that the Council's tactical divisions don't typically prioritize." She pulled up a secondary file on the main display and turned it so the room could see it clearly. The researchers noted something in their observations, something they described specifically as an anomaly, something they flagged and then, as far as I can tell, nobody followed up on because it didn't fit the threat classification framework they were working within. The room looked at the file. Several alien delegates made sounds of confusion or uncertainty. Kethvan leaned forward slowly, his secondary eye cluster contracting with the specific focus of someone who has just noticed that the ground they're standing on might not be as solid as they assumed. "It says," he read slowly and precisely, as though the words might mean something different if he went faster, "that in the 3 recorded instances where Vrethkel encountered creatures classified as non-threatening juveniles, it did not attack." "It didn't just not attack," Nair said, and her voice was quiet now, the quiet of someone presenting evidence rather than arguing. "It stopped, it observed. In one case," she highlighted the relevant section of the file, expanding it so every screen in the chamber showed the same passage. "It allowed a juvenile Kethri creature to climb onto its foreleg for approximately 4 minutes before the creature's parents retrieved it in a panic." She paused, she let the room sit with that. 4 minutes. Uninterrupted, "This is a creature that has destroyed war cruisers for being slightly inconvenient. That has folded ships because it found their presence annoying. It let a baby climb on it and did nothing except observe." The chamber was very, very quiet. Nair looked at the ambassador. The ambassador looked at Nair. Between them passed the kind of wordless communication that only develops between colleagues who have spent enough time in difficult situations together to have built a shared internal language, a language made of glances and the particular angle of a held breath and the almost imperceptible tightening around the eyes that means, I know what you're thinking, I'm thinking it too. Neither of us wants to say it out loud because saying it out loud makes it real." "No," said Ambassador Osai. The word came out flat and immediate, but her tone was the tone of someone who has already begun to consider the thing they are saying no to, the tone of a person who says no as a first response while their mind is already running the calculations, already turning the idea over in their hands, already looking for the angles, because they are the kind of person who cannot hear about 11 people on a drifting ship without looking for every angle, no matter what those angles cost them personally. The chamber waited. Nobody spoke. The hum of the station's life support systems was audible in the silence, the constant, low, indifferent sound of machinery keeping everyone alive while the room collectively held its breath. Ambassador Osai looked at the behavioral analysis still displayed on every screen in the chamber. She looked at the passage about the juvenile Kethri creature and the 4 uninterrupted minutes. She looked at the number 11, which was still on the secondary display in the corner. 11 people, 11 families, 11 futures contingent on a decision made in this room in the next few hours. She looked at Nair. Nair did not look away. "Tell me," Osai said at last, and her voice was careful and deliberate and already tired with the knowledge of what she was about to agree to, "what the xenobiological data says about why it responded differently to juveniles. Tell me what the researchers theorized." Nair pulled up the next section of the file. "They theorized," she said, "that Vrethkal processes juveniles as categorically distinct from adults, that something in its cognitive framework places non-threatening young creatures outside the normal threatory relevance binary it applies to everything else. They used the word curiosity. They noted it 3 times across the different incident reports." She looked up from the display. They also noted in the final summary that the juvenile Kethri's parents reported the creature had made no aggressive movements, no threatening sounds, and no attempt whatsoever to remove the juvenile from its foreleg for the full 4 minutes. The parents retrieved the juvenile. Vrethkal, according to the report, watched them go. Another silence, a different texture this time, thoughtful. The particular quality of a room that is looking at an impossible thing and finding, reluctantly, that it might not be entirely impossible after all. "The Meridian has 11 crew," Ostel said. His voice had changed. "Some of the controlled edge was gone. 4 of them are parents." Nobody had said that out loud yet. The words sat in the air of the chamber, and everyone present felt their weight slightly differently than before. Ambassador Osai looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked up at the full chamber, at the Zyphari delegates and the Zethali scientists and the representatives from 8 other civilizations, all of them watching her with expressions that ranged from horror to reluctant, desperate hope. And she thought about her niece, 7 years old and gap-toothed, who had learned 6 words in Zyphari specifically to say the most respectful possible thing to a diplomat from another world, simply because she had decided she wanted to. "I need to make a call," Ambassador Osai said quietly. "A private one. Give me 20 minutes." She stood up from the table. Nair watched her go and said nothing because there was nothing left to say. The data was on the screen, the ship was drifting, the clock was running. Somewhere on Council Station Verath 7, in a common room near the human delegation's quarters, a 7-year-old girl named Sophia was almost certainly in the middle of learning how to say something polite in another species' language, just because she thought it might make someone's day a little better. Ambassador Osai walked toward the door, and her footsteps were very even, and her face was very still, and none of the alien delegates could tell what she was feeling, because she had spent 20 years learning to carry impossible things without letting them show. But Lieutenant Commander Nair, who had known her for 6 of those years, watched the line of her shoulders as she walked away, and knew. She was already saying yes. The deadliest dragon in the galaxy stunned aliens when a human child gave it a kiss. Sophia meets a dragon. They told Sophia the truth because her aunt believed in telling children the truth. This was not a universal philosophy among the adults Sophia knew. Some of them believed in careful softening, in edges rounded down until nothing sharp remained, in explanations built from comfortable half-truths assembled into shapes that looked like the whole picture from a distance, but weren't, not really. Sophia had noticed this about adults for as long as she could remember, the way their voices sometimes changed when they were talking to her, going slightly higher, slightly smoother, the way people's voices went when they were managing something rather than sharing it. Her Aunt Yara's voice never changed like that. So when Ambassador Osai sat down across from her niece in the small private room off the human delegation's quarters, the one Sophia had already decorated with drawings she'd made of every alien species she'd met so far, taped carefully to the wall in a loose approximation of a solar system she found aesthetically pleasing, and said, "I need to tell you something important, and I need you to really listen." Sophia put down the drawing she was working on and gave her aunt her full attention. Because that tone meant the real version of things was coming. They told her there was a very big dragon, the biggest one in the known galaxy, in fact, the largest recorded dragon in any known system, which Sophia filed away as significant because she wanted to be precise about these things. They told her it was very dangerous, more dangerous than anything else alive anywhere, which was a remarkable claim and which Sophia took seriously because her aunt did not exaggerate. They told her that it had never hurt a small creature before, that there were 3 recorded instances of it encountering young things and choosing, each time not to destroy them, which was notable given that it destroyed most other things without apparent difficulty or hesitation. They told her there was a ship called the Meridian, carrying medicine, carrying 11 people, drifting helplessly in the dragon's territory. They told her that the ship would be safe if it could drift for 19 more days without the dragon noticing it and deciding it was inconvenient. They told her that something needed to keep the dragon's attention elsewhere for those 19 days. Lieutenant Commander Nair, who was sitting slightly behind Ambassador Os with the expression of someone who had proposed something they were still not entirely sure about, added quietly that 4 of the 11 crew members on the Meridian were parents. They told Sophia that no one would make her do anything. They were very clear about this, more clear than people usually were about things Sophia was and wasn't allowed to do, which itself told her something about how serious they were being. They told her she could absolutely say no, that no one would be angry, that no one would even be disappointed, that it was an enormous thing to ask and they understood that. They told her that if she said yes, her aunt would be beside her the entire time, every moment, and that she would carry a communication device, and that the single word home spoken into it would end everything immediately and they would leave without question or delay. There was a xenobiologist in the room as well, a narrow-built Zethali named Risvar, who had spent 40 years studying Vrethkal from the maximum possible safe distance, and had a professional relationship with the dragon that consisted entirely of observing it through long-range instruments and being grateful for the range. Risvar stood near the door with the particular stillness of a person who was present because their expertise had been requested, but who was increasingly uncertain whether their expertise covered what was currently happening. Sophia listened to all of it without interrupting, which was not her default mode but which she deployed when something was important enough to deserve the full weight of her attention. When they finished, she was quiet for a moment. Her hands were flat on the table. Her eyes were focused on something in the middle distance that wasn't the wall or the people in the room but rather the interior of her own thinking, where she was working through something in the methodical, unhurried way she approached things she took seriously. Then she asked her 3 questions. The first was whether the dragon was definitively the biggest one in the galaxy, because she wanted to be precise and didn't want to go in with incorrect information. Risvar confirmed, yes, Vrethkal was the largest recorded dragon across all charted systems, possibly the largest that had ever existed, though the fossil record was incomplete in ways that made absolute claims difficult. The current data, however, was unambiguous. Sophia nodded once, filing this. The second question was whether any of the 11 people on the ship had kids. A pause. Nair answered yes, 4 of them, a total of 7 children between them. Sophia's expression did something brief and complicated, something that moved through her face like weather there and gone, and then settled back into seriousness. The third question was whether dragons liked being pet. Risvar opened their mouth, closed it, opened it again, and said with the careful honesty of a scientist confronted with a data gap, they genuinely did not know. There was no recorded instance of anyone attempting it with Vrethkal. There was no recorded instance of anyone being in a position to attempt it and surviving long enough to submit a report. Sophia considered this for another moment. Then she nodded, with the decisive air of someone who has completed their assessment and reached a conclusion. Okay, she said, but I want to bring it something. The preparation took 4 hours, which was not much time for something of this magnitude, but was all the time they had before the probability window for the dragon, noticing the meridian would begin its steep climb upward. Sophia spent most of those 4 hours in the geology sample lab, which she had discovered 2 weeks earlier and visited regularly, because the specimens were extraordinary and the lead researcher, a soft-spoken Zethali named Oreth, had been delighted to have someone ask so many questions. Sophia moved through the sample cases with purpose, examining things with careful attention, holding them up to the light, putting them back. She was looking for something specific. She knew it when she saw it, she told Oreth, who accepted this and simply walked with her and answered her questions about what each specimen was and where it had come from. She found it in the 3rd cabinet from the end, a piece of crystallized mineral from the deep core survey of a planet in the outer reach, large enough that she needed both hands to hold it. Deep red, saturated and rich as old garnets, shot through with veins of gold that caught the laboratory light and fractured it into a scatter of warm points across the walls and ceiling. It was heavy and smooth, and it was, without question, the most beautiful object Sophia had encountered in 6 months of galactic travel, which was a high bar given some of the things she'd seen. Can I have this? She asked Oreth. Oreth looked at it, looked at Sophia, looked at the room where Ambassador Osai and Lieutenant Commander Nair were standing near the door with the expressions of people who had cleared this already or were prepared to clear it immediately. Yes, said Oreth, of course. Sophia wrapped it carefully in the cloth she'd brought for the purpose, a piece of deep blue fabric from her own bag, soft and thick, and placed it in her backpack with the deliberate care of someone transporting something that mattered. She fastened the backpack. She put it on. She adjusted the straps. Then she looked at her aunt. "Ready," she said. They approached Vrethkel's planet in a small, unarmed shuttle, deliberately, visibly, obviously unarmed, because the xenobiological data was very clear on the dragon's response to weaponry, and the word the Council's researchers had used was immediate, followed by total, and nobody involved wanted to test the accuracy of that description. Ambassador Osai flew the shuttle herself. She had insisted on this with a quiet firmness that didn't invite discussion. If something went wrong, she was going to be the one at the controls. Sophia sat in the co-pilot seat with her backpack on her lap and the composure of someone who had made a decision and was now simply moving through the world that decision had created. She was not performing calm. She had no audience in the shuttle that she felt the need to perform for. She was simply herself, curious, attentive, and entirely committed to the thing she had agreed to do in the way that Sophia committed to things, which was wholly and without reserve. She watched the planet grow from a dark point to a surface as they descended through the atmosphere, or what passed for atmosphere here, thin and acrid smelling, in a way that the shuttle's external sensors reported with a long list of chemical compounds that Ambassador Osa had chosen not to read aloud. The landscape that emerged through the viewport was exactly as the reports had described it, and somehow still worse for being real rather than recorded. Cracked black rock that looked like it had been broken rather than formed, spreading in every direction to a flat, featureless horizon. A sky the color of ash that let through just enough light to see by, gray and flat and shadowless, the kind of light that made everything look like it had been drained of something essential. No vegetation, no water, no sound from anything alive. Except for the vast, impossible shape coiled on a ridge in the distance. Even from 2 kilometers out in the bad light, with the viewport between her and the reality of it, Vrethkel was immense in a way that the mind refused initially to fully accept. There was a cognitive delay, a moment of processing lag, as if the visual information was too large to be interpreted in the usual time. Ambassador Osai, who had spent 20 years in rooms with the most powerful beings of a dozen civilizations, felt something move through her chest that bypassed all her training and experience and went directly to the oldest, most fundamental layer of her nervous system, the layer that predated language and reason and diplomatic protocol, the layer that was simply an organism recognizing something larger and more dangerous than itself, and reporting this with extreme urgency. She breathed, she kept flying. Sophia pressed her nose against the viewport. "It's beautiful," she said. Her voice was not ironic. It was not the beauty of something terrible that some adults described when they were trying to intellectualize fear. It was the uncomplicated, direct, fully meant recognition of a child encountering something extraordinary. The same voice she'd used in the geology lab when she first held the crystal. The same voice she'd used when she'd seen the gas giant from the observation deck. A vast amber swirl against the black, and had gone completely silent for 3 minutes before saying, "I didn't know things could look like that." Ambassador Osai looked at the dragon on the ridge and tried, for a moment, to see it through her niece's eyes. Tried to set aside the threat assessments and the folded ships and the 16 traumatized survivors and simply look at the creature itself. 40 meters of ancient scale and wing and terrible power, coiled on broken rock under a dead sky, alone on a hollow planet in a sector of space that every other living thing in the galaxy had agreed to avoid. She wasn't entirely successful, but she tried. They landed the shuttle a distance that Risvar, advising remotely through the communication system, described as respectful, far enough to not be immediately threatening, close enough that the shuttle was clearly visible and its occupants identifiable as small and in at least one case very young. The dragon had gone utterly still the moment their vessel broke atmosphere. Every sensor on the Council's surveillance satellites, positioned at the outermost possible distance from which they could still record anything useful, captured the same moment. Vrethkel's head lifting from where it had been resting on its forelimbs. Slowly, without urgency, the way very old and very confident things move, and 4 enormous eyes, each one the size of the shuttle, fixing on the small approaching craft with an expression that the xenobiologist watching the feeds would spend considerable time arguing about in the hours and days and months that followed. The arguments would center on whether the expression could be described as curiosity, whether curiosity was even an applicable framework for a creature of Vrethkel's classification, and whether the observer's instinct to read it as such was projection or perception. They would not resolve these arguments quickly, but they would all agree without dissent on what the expression was not. It was not aggression. It was not the preparatory stillness that preceded an attack, which the behavioral records documented in specific and reproducible detail. It was something else. Something that did not have a name in any existing xenobiological taxonomy, which meant the field would need to develop one, which was the kind of problem that made certain kinds of researchers feel quietly thrilled even in circumstances as alarming as these. Ambassador Osai opened the hatch. The air hit her immediately, hot, dense with ozone and the smell of ancient rock and something else beneath it. Something mineral and electric, and old in a way that the word old didn't quite cover. That required a word for the smell of a thing that had existed for so long it had become part of the geological history of a place. The wind moved across the cracked plain with a low, continuous sound that was not quite a sound, but also a pressure. Something felt in the sternum and the inner ear simultaneously. A vibration at the frequency of something very large breathing. She stepped out first as they had agreed. She stood in the open for a long moment, still visible, arms slightly away from her body in a posture that Risvar had described as non-threatening across most recorded species, which was the most reassurance the xenobiologist had been willing to offer and let Vrethkel see her. Let those four enormous golden eyes take the measure of her. She met the gaze as steadily as she could, which took most of what she had. Vrethkel watched her, did not move, did not make a sound. Then Sophia climbed out. She appeared in the hatch with her backpack and her purple jacket, the one with the embroidered stars on the sleeves, which she had chosen specifically and deliberately for this occasion because it was her best jacket, and going to meet the biggest dragon in the galaxy seemed like the right situation for her best jacket. And she stepped down onto the black rock and looked up. She looked up at the ridge where Vrethkel lay coiled, still as carved stone, four eyes burning gold against the gray sky, and the expression on her face was not the careful, controlled neutrality her aunt was wearing, was not the professional stillness of diplomatic training deployed against terror. It was open. It was direct. It was the face of a child who had decided to be fully present for something extraordinary and was making good on that decision. "Hi," she said. Her voice was very small against the landscape. The wind took the edges of it almost immediately. But sound carried strangely on this world, through the rock if not through the air, and the surveillance data would later confirm that Vrethkel's head, which had been still since they landed, moved fractionally in the direction of that sound. A tilt. A fraction of a degree, barely measurable, noted. Vrethkel did not move otherwise. Sophia walked forward. Behind her, Ambassador Osai controlled her breathing with the focused, deliberate precision of someone who had identified fear as a variable she could not afford to act on and was managing it with every technique she possessed. She had agreed to let Sophia lead this. She had agreed because the data said juvenile-led, non-threatening approach, and because Sophia had asked to lead it, and because her niece was 7 years old and had already demonstrated more raw diplomatic instinct than most professionals she'd worked with, and because there was a ship with 11 people and 7 children between them drifting in the dark. She stayed where she was. Her hand rested near the communication device without gripping it. Her eyes did not leave her niece for a single second. Sophia walked until she was 20 meters from Vrethkel's nearest forelimb and stopped. The forelimb itself was larger than the shuttle. The talons at its end were each longer than Sophia was tall. The scale directly above where she stood was a single plate of black the size of a dining table, and it was one of thousands, and the creature it belonged to extended in every direction beyond it for a distance that made the concept of scale feel like it needed to be recalibrated. Sophia looked up at all of it. She did not look small. This was not because she was objectively, measurably, almost absurdly small in relation to the thing she was standing in front of. She looked small in the way that things look small before they speak, and then stop seeming small after they do. "I brought you something," she said. She unzipped the backpack with steady hands. She unwrapped the blue cloth carefully, fold by fold, the way she'd been taught to unwrap things that mattered. The crystal came free and caught even the flat gray light of this dead sky and did what it did: broke it, fractured it, threw it back in warm fragments of red and gold that scattered across the black rock around Sophia's feet like something alive. She held it up with both hands, arms extended, the way you hold something up when you want the other person to really see it. The offering was unambiguous. The intention behind it was unambiguous. There was nothing in Sophia's posture that was strategic or calculated or designed. She had found the most beautiful thing she could, and she was giving it, and her face said exactly that and nothing else. For a long moment, nothing in the world moved. Then Vrethkel moved. Not with the terrible velocity, not with the sudden, catastrophic purpose that the Council's footage documented in the instance before destruction. The dragon moved the way glaciers move, slowly, massively, with a carefulness that was almost absurd in something so enormous, as though it was trying very hard to be something other than what it was, trying to reduce itself to a scale that would not overwhelm. One enormous head descended from the ridge on the end of a neck that was wider than the shuttle and blocked out a significant portion of the visible sky. And it descended slowly, incrementally, with pauses built into the movement like punctuation. This slowly, this carefully, watch, I am being careful, until the head was level with the ground, level with Sophia, one ancient golden eye the size of her entire body looking at her from a distance of less than 3 meters. Ambassador Osai stopped breathing entirely. Sophia did not step back. Her feet remained exactly where they had been. Her arms remained extended. The crystal caught the light from Vrethkel's own eyes, those 4 burning points of gold, and threw it back in new patterns across the rock. The exhalation from the dragon's nostrils reached Sophia then, a wave of heat that moved her hair and pressed against her jacket and wrapped around her like something with weight and intention. The smell arrived with it, lightning and old iron and forge heat, and beneath all of that something else, something that had no catalog entry in any human language, something that lived in the frequency of very old and very large things, the specific smell of something that had been alive for so long that it had become part of the chemistry of the places it inhabited. Sophia looked directly into the eye that was looking at her. She did not look away. Not because she was performing bravery, she was not performing anything, but because the eye was extraordinary and she had come here to see extraordinary things, and looking away from something extraordinary seemed like a waste. "I thought you might like it," she said. Her voice was completely steady. "It's pretty, you seem like you'd like pretty things." One forklaw, vast, ancient, tipped with talons that had cored starships and cracked open planets and folded a war cruiser into something the size of a letter, moved across the black rock with a sound like distant thunder, and settled near Sophia's feet, and from that claw extended a single talon slowly, deliberately, and touched the crystal that Sophia held in her outstretched hands. Not taking it, not gripping it, just touching it, the very tip of the talon, the lightest possible contact, with a gentleness so extreme that it seemed to cost the dragon something, seemed to be an act of sustained concentration, the way it costs a person something to hold a thing they could easily crush and choose not to. Featherlight, a breath of contact, a question maybe, or the beginning of an answer to one. The talon withdrew. The great head tilted slowly, that same enormous carefulness, and the burning gold eye moved from the crystal in Sophia's hands to Sophia's face. It moved with the attention of something that was genuinely, fundamentally, deeply looking, the way things look when they have encountered something that doesn't fit any existing category and is therefore requiring the creation of a new one. Sophia looked back. The wind moved across the plain. The gray light held steady over everything. On the surveillance feeds, 47 beings on Council Station Verath 7 watched a 7-year-old girl and the most dangerous creature in the known galaxy look at each other across a distance of 3 meters on a dead planet at the edge of occupied space. And not one of them spoke, because there are moments when speaking feels like it would break something that cannot be repaired. "I'm Sophia," she said. "What's your name?" The dragon was still. The eye did not move from her face. The warmth of its breath moved around her steadily, rhythmically, like the world itself breathing. Somewhere in the vast and ancient architecture of Vrethkel's attention, something had shifted. Something had opened or turned or begun, some process for which the xenobiological survey files had no existing framework, which meant the xenobiologist watching the feeds would need to build one from scratch, starting from this moment, from this image. A small human child with a red and gold crystal in her outstretched hands, asking the deadliest creature in the galaxy its name, and waiting with complete and genuine patience for whatever came next. Her aunt stood 20 meters behind her and did not breathe and did not look away and felt, alongside the fear that had not gone anywhere and was not going to, something else beginning, something she didn't have a name for yet, something that would take the full 19 days ahead of them to properly understand. Something that had started the moment Sophia had pressed her nose against the viewport and said it's beautiful and meant it without reservation. The surveillance feeds recorded all of it, every frame, every second. It was, the xenobiologist would agree later, the beginning of something entirely new. 19 days. The Council's surveillance footage of what followed became, depending on who was watching it and what framework they brought to the viewing, either the most astonishing or the most profoundly baffling record in the entire history of galactic diplomacy. Every major institution in the known galaxy would eventually request a copy. The Sci-Fi Military Academy would use it in their threat assessment curriculum for a decade, not as an example of successful engagement strategy, but as an illustration of the limits of existing classification systems, as evidence that their models for predicting dangerous entity behavior had a gap in them large enough for a 7-year-old human girl to walk through without slowing down. The Zethali Institute of Xenobehavioral Science would publish 14 separate peer-reviewed papers analyzing different segments of the footage, each paper careful and thorough and hedged with appropriate scientific qualification, and each one arriving, through its own particular path of evidence and reasoning, at conclusions that its authors clearly found simultaneously thrilling and deeply unsettling. The Galactic Council's own diplomatic training division would eventually incorporate it into their foundational curriculum under the heading, Non-Standard Contact Outcomes, what the models don't account for. But all of that came later. In the hours and days immediately following the landing on Vrethkel's planet, what the footage showed was simply this. For 19 days, the humans stayed. It had not been the plans. The plan had been constructed carefully, with input from xenobiologists and tactical advisors and diplomatic protocol specialists, and two separate council subcommittees who had convened emergency sessions specifically to review and sign off on the approach. The plan involved maintaining a cautious, measured presence, occupying enough of Vrethkel's attention to keep the dragon's awareness focused away from the drifting meridian without provoking any response that might accelerate the very outcome they were trying to prevent. Ambassador Osai had prepared talking points, though she'd been honest with herself that the likelihood of deploying them in any conventional sense was low. She had contingency protocols arranged in a hierarchy from unlikely to be needed to if we reach this one, we're already in trouble. She had 3 separate exit strategies, each practiced until she could execute them without conscious thought. The plan was thorough, professional, and built on the best available data. The plan lasted approximately 6 hours. What actually happened was that on the first evening, as the gray light began to flatten further toward darkness, and the temperature on the plane dropped by enough degrees that Sophia's breath became faintly visible, Sophia turned to Vrethkel, who had spent most of the afternoon simply being present. A vast dark mass coiled at the edge of the immediate area. Its 4 golden eyes moving periodically between the horizon and the small human who had arrived with a red and gold crystal, and the apparent conviction that this was a perfectly reasonable place to spend time, and asked if she could see its wings up close. Not the wings from 20 meters away, which was where they had been, not the wings from the safe viewing distance that the contingency protocols specified. Up close. Ambassador Osai, standing nearby with her talking points and her 3 exit strategies, opened her mouth. Vrethkel, the shadow that burns, the last thing you see, the creature that had destroyed war cruisers for being slightly inconvenient, and whose very name was used across 17 star systems to frighten young things into compliance, extended one wing slowly along the ground. Not a threat display, not the full 6-winged expansion that the atmospheric records documented creating storms. One wing, lowered in a single long movement of extraordinary deliberateness, laid flat against the black rock so that its full structure was accessible, visible, reachable, so that the small human who had asked to see it could walk under it if she wanted to. Which Sophia immediately did, stepping under the vast membrane with the enthusiasm of someone entering a cathedral they'd heard about for years and were finally standing inside. Ambassador Osai sat down on a nearby rock. She sat down because her legs had made a unilateral decision about what they were going to do next, and standing was not on the list. She sat and watched her niece walk under the wing of the most dangerous creature in the known galaxy, and she breathed, and she did not reach for the communication device, and she held the shape of what was happening in her mind with the careful, slightly dazed quality of someone trying not to drop something fragile. Inside the wing, the light changed. Even the flat gray of this dead world sky filtering through the membrane from above transformed, the black scales becoming translucent in the stretched spans between the structural bones, turning deep amber, turning the color of old honey and firelight, throwing a warmth of color over Sophia and the rock below her that was the only warm thing in the entire landscape. Sophia stopped in the middle of it and looked up. "It's like a stained glass window," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the windless pocket of air beneath the wing. "We have those at home, in the old building near my school. When the sun comes through them in the afternoon, it looks," she paused, searching for the right comparison, "it looks like this." She was not speaking to her aunt. She was speaking to Vrethkel, telling the dragon something about herself, about where she came from, about the things she found beautiful at home, offering it, without any calculation or strategy behind the offering, simply because she was under the dragon's wing and it seemed right to say. Vrethkel made a sound then. It was low enough that it was felt before it was heard, a vibration that moved through the rock and up through the soles of Ambassador Osai's boots and into her bones, a subaudible resonance that was not silence and not quite sound, but something that lived in the register between them. The xenobiologists monitoring the feeds from the surveillance satellites tagged it within the hour. Vocalization type unknown, no aggressive markers present, no precedent in existing behavioral catalog, possible analog to category. Contentment, classification pending further data. The classification would remain pending for 3 weeks, during which time the xenobiologists would accumulate considerably more data of the same kind and eventually stop calling it pending, and simply call it what every one of them had privately called it from the first moment they heard it. Ambassador Osai sat on her rock and listened to the most dangerous creature in the known galaxy make a sound that had no name in any existing scientific taxonomy, and she sent a progress report back to the council. because she was a professional and professionals documented things even when the things they were documenting were actively defying their entire framework for understanding reality. She received 17 responses within the hour. The majority were variations on a single word, rendered in 17 different registers of bewildered, desperate, fascinated disbelief. So, by day 3, the structure of their days had already established itself with an organic consistency that nobody had planned for, and everyone had simply adapted to, the way people adapt to things when the alternative is wasting time on resistance. Sophia had claimed a rock near Vrethkel's preferred resting position and named it her spot. It was not a remarkable rock in any geological sense, flat-topped, roughly the right height for sitting, with a slight lean to one side that Sophia had adapted to by sitting with her legs extended and her weight shifted accordingly. She had personalized it on the second day by arranging 3 of the smallest specimens from the geology sample backpack she'd brought along the perimeter in a line, which she'd told her aunt was so the spot was easier to find, and which Ambassador Osai strongly suspected was because Sophia liked having her things arranged around her in the same way at home. Every morning Sophia went to her spot, and every morning Vrethkel was already there, already lowered, already still, the great head resting on the black rock at a distance that had shortened incrementally and without apparent deliberateness. Over the first 3 days from 40 meters to 20 to something that could, in a significant stretch of the meaning, be described as nearby. The 4 golden eyes, half-closed, not sleeping, the xenobiologists were certain they weren't sleeping, the physiological markers were distinct, but something adjacent to it. The specific quality of attention that belongs to something that has found a place it wants to be and has settled into being there. Sophia would sit at her spot and talk. She talked about her school, which was a low building surrounded by trees that lost their leaves in autumn, which she found both sad and beautiful in a way she'd not yet found the right words for. She talked about her friends Priya, who was named after the lieutenant commander, which Sophia found cosmically satisfying, and James, who was frightened of birds but pretended not to be, and Amber, who could do mental arithmetic faster than the classroom's computing assistant and was modest about it in a way that somehow made it more impressive. She talked about a book she had read twice and was partway through reading a third time, about a girl who discovered that the forest near her house was more complicated than it appeared, which Sophia had opinions about. She talked about a song her mother sang when she was washing dishes, not a famous song, just a song her mother had learned from her mother, passed down without documentation, existing only in the memory of the people who loved it. Vrethkel lay with its head on the rock and its golden eyes half-closed and did not move. The xenobiologists, watching the footage with the focused intensity of people whose professional worldview was being quietly and thoroughly reconstructed from the foundation up, described its expression with an increasing reluctance to use the word they all kept arriving at independently. They used attentive for a while. They used oriented toward the stimulus for a while after that, which fooled nobody. Eventually, one of them, the youngest member of the team, who had less professional reputation to lose and considerably more courage as a result, wrote in her observation notes, in plain language, what the footage showed. The dragon is listening. After a brief charged silence in the monitoring room, nobody argued with her. By day 6, Vrethkel had begun bringing things. This development caused a significant spike in communication traffic between the surveillance team and the council, because it was not anything any existing model had predicted, and it required immediate and careful documentation. The first object appeared before Sophia arrived at her spot on the morning of the 6th day, a chunk of deep blue mineral, roughly the size of Sophia's torso, with a crystalline surface structure that caught the flat gray light and did interesting things with it. It was sitting near the rock when Sophia arrived, placed with a precision that was clearly intentional, not dropped, not left accidentally, but placed, oriented so that its most visually complex face was upward and outward. Sophia looked at it for a moment, looked at Vrethkel, looked back at the mineral. Then she sat down and picked it up and examined it with the thorough, unhurried attention she gave to things in the geology lab, turning it in her hands, holding it at different angles, observing what it did with whatever light it could find. She described it out loud as she examined it, not for any audience in particular, simply because she processed interesting things by talking about them. Its color, its structure. The way the crystalline formations had grown in repeating geometric patterns that suggested something ordered in the underlying chemistry. The way it was heavy in a way that felt different from rocks that looked similarly sized, which meant its density was higher, which was interesting. Vrethkel watched her examine it. The golden eyes tracked the object as it moved in Sophia's hands. There was a quality to the attention, a specific concentrated stillness, that the xenobiologist with the courage had begun to label in her notes as anticipatory, and which her colleagues had stopped arguing about after the 3rd day. This became the rhythm of the mornings. Something new at Sophia's spot, a smooth stone that had been polished by processes this dry, waterless world shouldn't have been able to accomplish, which Sophia puzzled over aloud for 20 minutes. A piece of metal debris from an unnamed ship, its surface oxidized into patterns of rust and green and deep orange that made it look like a small abstract painting, which Sophia immediately loved and added to the perimeter arrangement around her rock. A formation of mineral that had grown in a perfect spiral, the mathematics of it elegant in a way that needed no explanation. Each one brought and set down and then waited for, the enormous eyes watching as the small hands picked it up and turned it over and found the particular language for what made it worth looking at. Neither party seemed to require explanation for this arrangement. It had simply become what they did. The xenobiologists called it reciprocal object exchange in their official documentation, and the most remarkable thing I have ever observed in 30 years of this work in their private correspondence. On day 9, Sophia asked if she could touch its scales. The question was casual, the same tone she used for most of her questions, the tone of someone for whom asking was simply the natural extension of wanting to know something. She was already sitting close to Vrethkel's lowered head, closer than she'd been on day 1, closer than she'd been on day 6, the distance having contracted in the same organic, unplanned way that the mornings had established themselves. She looked at the jaw above her, the vast, smooth architecture of scale, and she looked at her hand, and she looked back at the jaw, and she asked. 47 beings on Council Station Varath 7 were watching the surveillance feed at that moment. The monitoring room went completely silent. Vrethkel lowered its head, that same sustained, deliberate carefulness, slower than slow, nothing sudden, nothing that could be misread, until the jaw rested on the rock directly in front of Sophia, close enough to touch without reaching. Still, Sophia stood up from her spot. She took 2 steps forward. She raised her right hand and placed it flat against a scale near the jaw, a single scale that was larger than her entire body, its surface black and absolute in its color, its edges overlapping the scales around it with the precision of something grown rather than built. She spread her fingers as wide as they would go. She was quiet for a moment, feeling whatever she was feeling, temperature, texture, the information that came through the skin and went directly to whatever part of the brain processes the reality of a thing. It's warm, she said. Her voice was soft, not with caution but with the specific quality that comes with genuine discovery. And it's not rough. I thought it would be rough. All the pictures made it look rough. It feels kind of smooth. Ambassador Osai, standing at her closest safe distance with her hand resting near the communication device that she had not used and was not going to use, made a sound that was technically classifiable as a response. It functioned more as confirmation that she was still present and still conscious, which was the most she could reliably commit to. Sophia kept her hand flat against the scale. She was looking up at the full enormity of the head above her. The angle from directly beneath it was something no living being in recorded history had experienced and survived, and her expression was not the expression of someone in the presence of danger. It was the expression of someone in the presence of something they recognized as extraordinary and were trying to be fully there for. "You're very beautiful," she told Vrethkel conversationally. "I don't think people tell you that enough. They're probably too scared. But you're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, and I've seen a gas giant up close, which was the previous winner." The subaudible sound moved through the rock and the air and into everyone who was present, and everyone who was watching from a safe distance many thousands of kilometers away. Deeper this time, fuller. The kind of sound that takes up more space than it should, that keeps resonating after it should have stopped, that seems to come from somewhere older than the biology producing it. Ambassador Osai closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, the world was still the same impossible, upended, reconstructed thing it had been for 9 consecutive days, and she had simply to keep being a professional in it. On day 14, the communication came through that she had been waiting for and dreading in roughly equal measure. The Meridian had corrected its navigation drift under its own power, a heroic piece of engineering by a crew working with limited resources in a high-pressure situation, performed entirely in silence because transmitting signals in Vrethkel's sector was unanimously considered inadvisable. The ship was on course to exit the Dragon's territory within 5 days. All 11 crew members were accounted for. The medical supplies intended for Hello's IV were intact. Osai waited until Sophia's morning session with Vrethkel had reached a natural pause, the late morning quiet that had developed as part of their days, when Sophia would sit with the Dragon's latest offering in her hands and simply be present without talking, which the xenobiologists had labeled companionable silence in their notes with only minimal professional hedging, and then she walked to her niece's spot and sat down beside her. She told her about the Meridian, about the 5 days, about what it meant for when they would leave. Sophia received this information the way she received most important information, quietly, fully, without immediate reaction. She sat with it for a moment, the blue mineral chunk in her hands, her eyes on the middle distance. "So we have to go soon," she said. "When the ship is safe, yes." Sophia looked at Vrethkel, who was arranged in the curve that had become its default afternoon posture, lying in a loose arc around the area of the plane where Sophia spent most of her time, close enough that any approach from any direction would require passing near the dragon first. The xenobiologists had a classification for this posture, arrived at after significant data review and considerable reluctance. Perimeter positioning, non-aggressive, possible protective behavior, classification ongoing. The ongoing had been there for 8 days. Nobody had removed it because removing it would require committing to what it meant, and committing to what it meant required accepting that the word protective was accurate. And accepting that the word protective was accurate meant accepting the full weight of what that implied about Vrethkel, about what it was, and what it had perhaps always been, underneath everything the galaxy had decided it was. "It won't like that," Sophia said. Her voice was even but not untouched. She was looking at the dragon with the expression of someone who has allowed themselves to care about something and is now reckoning with what caring costs. Osai sat down beside her on the rock that was slightly too small for 2 people but was the only option. "No," she agreed, "probably not." A pause, the wind moved across the plain. Vrethkel's breathing was slow and steady and present. "Can we come back?" Osai thought about all of it then, the council and its 17 responses to her first progress report, and its 47 people crowded around the surveillance feeds, and the 14 xenobiological papers that didn't exist yet but were going to. And her sister waiting at the colony station and Sophia's parents who did not know the details of the last 14 days and were going to need a thorough and carefully framed conversation, and the diplomatic implications of whatever this was. Whatever it had become, whatever it was still in the process of becoming. She thought about the conversation she would need to have with every relevant body of authority about what had been established here and what it meant and what should happen next. She thought about Vrethkel watching Sophia walk away. "I don't know," she said, "but I think we'll try." Sophia nodded, slow and certain. She put the blue mineral back in the perimeter arrangement around her spot with the precision of someone placing something in its right location. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at the dragon. 5 more days, she told Vrethkel quietly, as though she owed it the information, as though not saying it would be a kind of dishonesty she wasn't willing to practice. "Then I have to go for a while, but we'll come back." The golden eyes regarded her steadily from the black rock. The subaudible sound moved through everything. The morning of day 19 arrived with the specific quality of endings, not dramatic, not sharp, but present in the texture of ordinary things. The same gray sky, the same cracked plane, the same smell of ozone and old iron and something ancient and unnameable. Everything identical to the previous 18 mornings and different in the way things are different when you are paying attention because it is the last time. Sophia did not rush through it. She sat at her spot with the full collection of objects Vrethkel had brought her arranged around the rock in the order she'd received them, and she sat with each one for a while, turning it in her hands, the way she'd turned them when they arrived. She talked a little about the things she would tell people when she got back, about the drawings she was going to make, about the fact that she was going to find a way to learn whatever Vrethkel's language was so that the next time she came, the conversation could go both ways. She talked about what she was going to write in her letters. The dragon lay with its head on the rock and its 4 golden eyes half closed, and it listened the way it had listened for 18 days, with the particular quality of something that has decided this is where it is and where it wants to be. When the time came, Ambassador Osai stood up from her rock. Sophia stood up from hers. They had not discussed how this would go. Some things don't require discussion. Sophia picked up her backpack. She left the mineral collection arranged around the rock exactly as it was. She had decided this without saying so, and Osai had understood it without asking. The spot would remain the spot. The objects would remain where they were. This was important in a way that didn't require articulation. She walked to where Vrethkel's head rested on the black rock, and the 4 ancient golden eyes tracked her approach with the attention they always gave her, full, steady, completely present. She stopped in front of the dragon's face. She stood there for a moment without speaking, just being there, just being herself in front of this enormous thing that had spent 19 days choosing her company. Then she stepped forward. She reached up as high as her arms would go. She pressed both hands flat against the smooth warmth of the jaw directly below the nearest eye, the scale she had touched first on day 9, the one her hands already knew the temperature of. She leaned forward and she pressed her face against it, cheek and nose and forehead, the way you press into something warm when you are trying to stay inside the warmth for as long as possible. And she kissed it. Not a formal gesture, not a diplomatic action, not a strategy or a protocol or a calculated risk. The way she kissed her aunt goodnight at the end of long days on the station. The way she kissed her grandmother's cheek at the end of every visit, both hands on the old woman's face, making sure the moment was complete and real before it was over. The way a small human child kisses something she loves before she has to leave it, putting the full weight of what she feels into the contact, because she does not yet know how to be restrained about love, and has not been taught that she should be. Vrethkel went absolutely, completely still. The kind of still that was different from all the other stillnesses the dragon had inhabited over 19 days. Not the watchful still of something observing, not the deliberate still of something trying to be small. An arrested still, the stillness of something that has been reached in a place it did not know it had, that has been given something it did not know it was waiting for, that has been entirely stopped by the arrival of something new. On every surveillance feed, on every recording instrument, on every sensor that the Council had trained on that planet for 19 consecutive days, all of them captured the same image, held it, recorded it into whatever format their systems used to store things that needed to be kept. The most dangerous creature in the known galaxy, the shadow that burns, the last thing you see, destroyer of fleets, ender of civilizations, the thing that folded ships and cracked open planets and whose name was used across 17 star systems as the shape of absolute, unappealable danger. Frozen into total, absolute, complete motionlessness by a 7-year-old girl kissing it on the face. The monitoring room on Council Station Verath 7 was silent in a way that had never been achieved there before and would not be achieved there again. 47 beings of multiple species, some of whom had spent their entire careers studying Vrethkel, some of whom had joined the observation team for this specific mission, all of them utterly without words, not because there was nothing to say but because any word would have been insufficient, would have been a reduction of what they were watching into something smaller than it was, and none of them were willing to do that. The stillness lasted for a long time. Then Vrethkel exhaled. Not suddenly, not with the volcanic force that the records documented in aggressive displays. A long, slow, sustained exhalation, the kind that seems to come from somewhere deeper than lungs, deeper than breath, from whatever in a living thing corresponds to relief or recognition or the release of something held for longer than memory could measure. It moved Sophia's hair. It wrapped around her small body like something with intention, like a warmth that wanted to be felt. It moved out across the plain in a wave of heat that the sensors recorded as far as 50 meters. And with it came a sound. The instruments had recorded many things from Vrethkel over the years of observation. Threat vocalizations, documented in careful detail across multiple incidents. The impact sounds of destruction. The deep reverberations of the subaudible sound that had appeared in the last 19 days and still lacked a formal classification. The monitoring team knew every sound in the catalog. This was not any of them. It was soft, it was low. It rose from somewhere inside the enormous chest of the most dangerous creature in the known galaxy and moved through bone and scale and the rock below and the air around it, and arrived at the ears and the bodies of everyone present and everyone watching as something that required no translation, no analysis, no scientific hedging, no carefully worded peer-reviewed paper to identify. Every xenobiologist who reviewed the footage agreed, without dissent, within seconds of hearing it, in notes that used for the first time across all 14 pending papers the same plain and unambiguous word. Vrethkel was rumbling. Gently, the deep, resonant, involuntary sound of something very large and very old and very alone that has been, unexpectedly, after a very long time, without warning or precedent or preparation, cared for. The sound of something that had not known it was waiting to be cared for until the caring arrived, and was now making the only sound that fit. Sophia pulled back slowly. She looked at the enormous golden eye that was looking back at her with an expression that had moved entirely beyond the xenobiologist's capacity to classify, that would require entirely new language built specifically for this moment, that was in the end perhaps not classifiable at all and simply had to be understood as what it was. Vrethkel looking at Sophia the way things look at the first being in their entire existence to see them fully, and find them beautiful and say so without fear. "We'll come back," Sophia told it. Her voice was steady and certain with the particular certainty of someone who has made a promise and is making it with their whole self, not just their words. "I promise." Ambassador Osai's report to the Galactic Council was 43 pages long and included 17 appendices. It was thorough and professionally worded and built a careful, evidence-based case for everything it recommended, citing behavioral data and xenobiological analysis and diplomatic precedent where precedent existed and acknowledging clearly where it did not. She had written the last paragraph on the return journey, through 7 drafts, trying each time to find language that was accurate without sounding like something a child had made up. Language that conveyed the weight of what had happened without making the most respected diplomatic body in the known galaxy feel that it was reading a story rather than a report. In the end, she had stopped trying to protect the council from the reality of it and simply written what was true, because she was the ambassador who had sat on a rock on a dead planet for 19 days and watched her 7-year-old niece befriend the thing the entire galaxy feared, and she was no longer willing to round down the edges of that into something more manageable. The creature known as Vrethkal the Unmerciful, classified as a Category Omega threat and described by this council as uncontactable, non-negotiable, and beyond diplomatic reach, spent 19 days in voluntary, peaceful proximity to a human child. It accepted a gift. It demonstrated curiosity. It exhibited what our xenobiological observers have carefully, reluctantly, and unanimously classified as affection. It brought objects it considered beautiful to share with someone whose appreciation it had come to value. It listened, genuinely, fully, attentively, to a child describe her world. It allowed itself to be touched. It made sounds that no recording in 40 years of observation has documented, sounds for which our existing catalogs have no category, sounds that required us to build new language to describe what was being expressed. It was not commanded, coerced, or deceived into any of this behavior. It chose it every day freely for 19 consecutive days. We believe this changes our understanding substantially of what Vrethkal is and of what it has perhaps always been underneath everything we decided it was. We believe it changes our understanding of what diplomacy, at its most fundamental level, actually requires. We recommend further contact ongoing at the earliest opportunity. We note that Sophia has already written 3 letters to the dragon, which the delegation intends to deliver personally. We believe Vrethkal will be waiting. The council read it. Then they read it again. Then Kethvin, senior Zypheri representative, war survivor, the being who had approved 3 human trade agreements without reading them because a 7-year-old had said something kind about his secondary eye cluster, set down the report, and was quiet for a long moment in the way of someone who has just been asked to restructure something they have held as true for a very long time. How, he said again. But this time, unlike the 17 responses of the first night, it was not a question of disbelief. It was the question of someone who genuinely wanted to understand, who was prepared to sit with the answer for however long it took, who had decided, because the evidence demanded it, because 43 pages and 17 appendices demanded it, because the footage of a child pressing her face against a dragon's jaw demanded it, that understanding was now the most important thing. Outside the council station, in the sector of space that the galaxy had spent centuries agreeing to fear, on a cracked black planet under a dead gray sky, at a particular flat-topped rock with a slight lean to one side, a collection of beautiful objects sat arranged in careful order, waiting. As they would wait. As he would wait. For as long as it took for the small human to come back and keep her promise.